Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to the St. Mary's County Library presentation, Article 1, the U.S. Congress. This is part of a series about the American Revolution, the creation of the Constitution, things like that. And tonight, our guest speaker, Dr. Jim Gibb, will be presenting on Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, which is all about the roles and responsibilities of Congress. All right. Jim, would you be able to talk a little bit about your background?
I am an archaeologist and have been for 50 years as of next month. I'm not a historian, uh, although I do history as part of my work as an archaeologist, and I'm not a political historian. So this series of 9 talks is really sort of my questions, exploring the Constitution. It's a 9-part series. This is the fifth of them. I don't know what else is really interesting about me. I went to school, got degrees and all that. So anyway, if that's enough for you, Allison, I will proceed. Um, with all these talks, I begin with a quote. You don't have to read anything from slides, and because we're talking about the Constitution, there's a lot of it's rather text heavy. I mean, it's hard to do this in pictures. But I always like to start with a quote that I think is relevant, and this is from a novel by L.P. Hartley from 1953. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And I think that's important because, we tend to see folks in the 1700s as just kind of like us. They're a little weird. They wear, powdered wigs and short pants, and they talk a little bit funny. But they really were very different from what we are today. And that's really important because they gave us the owner's manual for our country, the Constitution. And so the way they thought about things then is not necessarily the way we think about things today. So anyway, we will proceed. So this is the fifth in a 9-part series. Sorry, it started out as a 6-part series, but it just grew. I have my email address there. If you want to contact me, you have any questions, comments, criticisms, by all means, email me. It's gibj at SI, which is Smithsonian Institution, .edu. Okay, so the U.S. Constitution, and I'm talking about just the body of it, not the 27 amendments that followed, but just the main body of the Constitution, I clock it at about 5,200 words. The number of words varies depending on what version you're looking at because there are things that people have injected, headings and whatnot. But, 5,200 words, say. So it's about 1,600, 16 pages of what you would think of as a college term paper. That's its length. More than half of the words in the Constitution are devoted to tonight's subject, Article 1, which is about Congress. And that's really important to understand because, you know, how did the framers see this government working? They put the first thing up is the Congress, not the executive branch, not the legislative branch. And most of the text is about the Congress. Article 1 has 10 sections as opposed to 4 for Article 2, which is the executive branch or president, and 3 sections for the judiciary, Article 3. What Article 1 is, it lays out how Congress gets elected, what powers they have, what powers they do not have. And so we're going to look at that this evening. A lot of this comes from a plan that came out of Virginia and presented to uh, the convention, the Constitutional Convention, by the then governor of Virginia. So it's called the Virginia Plan. And a lot of what eventually came out as the Constitution really draws heavily from that Virginia Plan. So, Article 1, I'm not going to read the whole Constitution. Y'all can find that online very easily. It's not a hard document to find. Sometimes a hard document to interpret, but it's not hard to find. Section 1 of Article 1 says all lawmaking powers in the houses of the Senate and representatives. often on the news and casual conversation when we refer to as when we talk about congressmen, what we mean are representatives, U.S. representatives. But congressman technically takes in Senate too. They're the two houses of Congress. Only Congress has the right to make federal law, not the executive branch, not the legislative branch. The first sentence in Article 1 is very clear about that. Now, the House of Representatives, um, again, let's just look at how the Constitution set up the number of words. More than 52% have to do with Article 1, 22% executive branch, 9% judicial, and Articles 4 and 7, which we'll deal with in a couple of months, really deals with the federal government and the states. But it's the first three we're dealing in Article 1 this month, 2, and then 3. So we'll have legislative, executive, and judicial branches covered. Uh, Section 2 stipulates that members are elected biannually. And if you want to vote for the U.S. representative for your district, you have to meet the same qualifications as those that you would need to vote for a delegate to the state's lower house. So most states had an upper and lower chamber, and some of them had different qualifications. You could vote for lower chamber, but may not meet qualifications for the upper chamber. And so all the Constitution is saying here is that you need to meet the same qualifications. Subsequent amendments basically got rid of that. If you're 18 and an American citizen and not a felon who's precluded from voting, then you can cast your vote. To be a U.S. representative, you have to be at least 25 years old. You have to be 7 years a citizen. That is, you could be a naturalized citizen, but you have to have been a citizen for at least 7 years, and you have to reside in the state that's electing you. It doesn't say you have to be a resident of the district for which you're running. In terms of apportionment, Section 3 says, how many votes, how many electoral votes does a state get? And it's all based on the census. How many people are there in the state? Borrowing from the Articles of Confederation, which I spoke about earlier in this series, the number of people in the state include all free persons, excluding Indians not taxed. Indians were considered basically a separate nation, not part of the U.S., and 3/5 of all other persons. This is the famous 3/5 clause that basically said it says all of the persons, but what they mean are slaves, because once you eliminate Indians not taxed and free persons, everybody else is probably a slave. And the idea is that the southern colonies, which had smaller populations, could count their slaves as persons, but not as a full person, only as 3/5 of a person. And you'll see the numbers in a moment, how that kind of works out. The census would be taken every 10 years, and it has been since 1790. And it's critical because that's how we determine how many representatives we have for each state in the Union. In the original Constitution, representatives, you could not have more than one representative per 30,000 people. So, interestingly enough, the first presidential veto had to do with how representatives were apportioned across the states. Bill, April 5th, 1792, George Washington vetoed this bill, not as unconstitutional. It really was about statistics, because they divided the entire population of the U.S. by 30,000 instead of using a common denominator for each state. And it assigned additional representatives to the 8 states that had the highest fractional remainder. You'll see what that looks like in a moment. Congress revised the bill, resubmitted it, George Washington signed it. And there he divided the each state by 34,764. That was the total population of the United States, including three-fifths of all enslaved people, divided by 105. They decided there would be 105 seats in the House of Representatives. So in this table, you could see each of the states, Connecticut down through Virginia, the number of free persons enumerated in each of those states, the number of slaves enumerated in each of those states, and then the number of slaves multiplied by zero point 0.6. That's how we get our three-fifths. And so we take that number, which in case of Connecticut comes to 1,658, add that to the total free, and that's how we get the total population. Divide that by 105. Um, at the time, 22% of the American population were enslaved. So counting that three-fifths made a real big difference in representatives for each of the states. Virginia had the largest representation, uh, with 18. Pennsylvania, Massachusetts were next. Pennsylvania had 12, Massachusetts 11. These were the big states, big populations, followed by New York and North Carolina. Uh, the last talk I gave, I showed you the breakdown and how just four or five of those states could basically run the House of Representatives. Their population was so large, the number of representatives they had just outweighed every other state. The Senate is a little bit different according to the original Constitution. Members were chosen by the state legislatures. We did not vote for our state senators. Our state legislatures voted for senators. That was superseded in 1913 by the 17th Amendment, after which we as voters got to vote for our senators as well as our representatives. Each senator, as we all, I hope, know, would serve for 6 years. Each senator could cast only one vote. Under the old Articles of Confederation, it didn't matter how many people you had in the uh, Second Continental Congress or the Confederate Congress, each state got one vote. But under the Constitution, each state has two senators and each of them gets the vote, and they don't always agree. One-third were elected biannually, and that's the case today. Every 2 years, about one-third of the Senate is up for election. If a seat is vacated in the Senate, generally the executive authority, that is the governor of that state, can temporarily appoint a person to fill that seat until the legislature meets. And then the legislature has its term while it's meeting to, if it wants, pick another senator. Nowadays, with the 17th Amendment, there has to be a special election. Senator has to be at least 30 years old. You think of that. A 30-year-old for a senator, a 25-year-old for a representative. We say we have some folks in those offices today that are that young, but boggles my imagination just a little bit. For a senator, you have to be at least 9 years a citizen of the United States and resident of the state for which you were elected. You can still be a nationalized citizen. The vice president is the presiding officer of the Senate. The vice president only votes when it comes to breaking a tie. And we've seen this happen quite a bit over the last few years where the vice president shows up in the Senate chamber, goes up to the podium. He now presides over the Senate. And if there's does that when there's a tie vote, casts his vote, and that breaks the tie. In this section, the subsection of the Constitution, the senators pick their own officers, and that includes the president pro tem. The president pro tem basically officially presides over the Senate when the vice president isn't there, which is most of the time. And in fact, most times the president pro tem doesn't serve. Um, some younger senator will serve to sort of, get a little bit of experience running a meeting, I guess. Notice it says members will choose President pro tem and other officers. The Constitution does not say that the Senate has to pick a senator for any of those positions. The Senate they could pick me. They could select me as President pro tem of the Senate if they wanted to. Not likely to happen, but it could. The Senate has sole power to try impeachments. We've been through a couple of impeachments in the last few years, so folks have some familiarity with this, I think. In the case of a president being impeached, it's the Chief Justice that presides, but impeachment is a process that can be brought against, it mostly has been brought against judges, but it could be brought against other officers, for instance, cabinet officers. And there's been talk recently about impeaching a couple of the current cabinet secretaries. That does not require the Chief Justice to preside. The Senate, in an impeachment, only the House can impeach an officer of the United States, including the president. The Senate tries that person. So the House essentially brings charges against an officer, and the Senate sits as a jury. It looks a lot like a trial, but it isn't. It's not a legal proceeding, it's a political proceeding. Um, if somebody is impeached and then convicted, basically they lose their job and perhaps can lose the opportunity to run for any other uh, office forever. But that's it. There is no punishment involved beyond that. Once a person is impeached and convicted, then and only then are they then subject to normal prosecution through the courts. Um, and initially, the both houses, the House and Senate, were supposed to begin their session on the first Monday in December. The 20th Amendment changed that to January 3rd. That's what we have today. January 3rd at noon, the new Congress takes over. The president, it used to be March 4th, and it is now January 20th to reduce the length of the lame duck session. The Congress always has to be seated before a president is inaugurated because it's the Congress that looks over approves the electoral college vote. Each house comes up with its own rules. So, for instance, the Senate has something called a filibuster, which I'm sure everybody's somewhat acquainted with. The House does not. There are many different rules that they have. Each of them is independent. Each publishes its own journal of its proceedings. I should say that what is said on the House floor or the Senate floor is not necessarily what appears in the published journals. Each member of each house can submit a written copy for publication. And what is said on the floor, at least officially, is essentially lost. Not politically necessarily, but it doesn't necessarily wind up in the House or Senate journals. And that you need their mutual consent to adjourn. Each senator, each congressman is paid by the federal treasury, not by their respective states. Uh, their compensation cannot be reduced while they're in office, and the late 20th century amendment prevents their salaries from being raised while they are in office. They have to wait for the next Congress to sit. Congressmen are protected from arrest while attending um, the Congress, and they cannot be arrested or uh, prosecuted for what they say on the floor of their respective houses. So a congressman, well, this came up recently. Greene had threatened to get a list of people who were being accused the Jeffrey Epstein thing. Now, those victims, if they announced those names themselves, would potentially be liable uh, for slander. But Marjorie Taylor Greene, as a sitting representative, could stand on the House floor and read that list, and she could not be prosecuted civilly or criminally. The lawmaking process, technically, all bills requiring revenue, raising money, have to emanate from the House of Representatives. I've not seen any practical advantage there because the Senate still gets to offer their own amendments. So where that where a money bill originates is kind of immaterial. It does make it look like that we as the voters, as the people behind this whole project, we decide when money is raised and spent. There is a part of Article 1, which is the enumerated powers. And these are the things that everybody should be aware of. They're really important. It allows Congress to collect taxes, borrow money, regulate trade, decide on how we naturalize citizens, bankruptcy laws. Only the federal government can coin money, fix weights and measures, establish post roads, establishes copyright and patent laws, an important innovation in the founding of our country that allows people to publish things or invent things and maintain their intellectual rights, their property rights, for at least for a set period of time. Establish inferior courts. This is going to be important when we talk about the judiciary in 2 months, because Article 3 that sets up the Supreme Court and all that is really, really short. And it leaves it to Congress really to sort of fill in the blanks. And they gave themselves the power to do that. Congress declares war, although I'm sure everybody knows Congress has not declared war since December 8, 1941, day after Pearl Harbor. Although we've been in a lot of wars, if you will, since then, Congress has not declared war. Congress has the right to raise and support armies. The thing is, though, for the Army, appropriations of money for the Army could not exceed 2 years in duration. The founders of our country were very leery about standing armies. They saw that as a tool of tyrants. And so they kept close purse strings on that. On the other hand, for subsection 13, the Congress could had the power to maintain a navy, and there was no limit on appropriation. So they could, appropriate over the course of 5 years money for the Navy. Partly they were not afraid of the Navy. Partly they needed the Navy to protect American shipping. And partly the Navy is they're building these big, expensive, complicated ships. You couldn't necessarily do that in 2 years. So they needed a longer funding. Uh, Make rules for government and regulation of the land and naval forces. Congress is in charge of our armed forces. They do the regulation, they make the rules. The president is commander in chief, commands these forces, but it's Congress that establishes the rules for our armed forces. 15 is really interesting given recent developments. Congress has the right to call forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. According to the original Constitution, the President of the United States cannot call forth the militia. It's Congress that does that. The President serves as their commander, but it's Congress that originally calls forth the militia.
Jim, we have
Uh,
a comment in the chat that I wanted to share.
sure.
And it says, I heard that the original plan for a, quote, military was to have a small professional army which would be kept in check by much larger militias, apparently.
That sentiment was probably expressed by a lot of our early leaders. And that's whether or not that's what they intended to do, that's what happened. At the time of we don't have good numbers from prior to oh, I think probably 1810 or so. I've tried to find the numbers, but from the seven after the Continental Army was demobilized, from then through the ratification of the Constitution, our standing army probably never consisted of more than 500 officers and men. So kind of a professional army, but 500 doesn't really leave you to do very much. It was state militias that provided most of our military strength. Um, Congress also has the right to make exclusive right to legislate for government-owned property. This includes the District of Columbia. It includes U.S. territories. It includes U.S. military bases. Anything that the federal government owns, Congress can legislate for. And it's kind of interesting because for the territories that we accumulated early around 1900, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, um, those became federal territories now and U.S. territories. And the Constitution did not extend. This is by Supreme Court cases, the so-called insular cases of 1903, I think. Those people in those colonies did not have full constitutional rights. They only had those constitutional rights that Congress would grant them. And that's still the case, although the Philippines is now an independent nation. Puerto Rico, American Samoa, and Guam are not. And of course, Congress has the power to make laws to make all this happen. After the enumeration of powers, there's also an enumeration of what I call shall nots, those things that they could not do. The first thing on there was in terms of importation of slaves, Article 1, Section 3, I think, prohibits Congress from making any laws that interfere with the importation of slaves until 1808. So for 20 years, the states could continue to make their own decisions as to whether or not it was legal to bring in slaves into their state. Uh, Congress cannot suspend the writ of habeas corpus, except under some very extreme situations like invasion. And this also has been in the news lately. Habeas corpus means that if you're arrested, you can demand, okay, why? Where's your evidence? On what basis are you holding this person, imprisoning this person? And so there are a lot of writs of habeas corpus out there right now being filed. Uh, Abraham Lincoln famously suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War. But once Congress came back into session, he got their approval for it. Technically, constitutionally, only Congress can suspend the writ of habeas corpus. And they might do it just for a district rather than nationwide. Congress cannot pass a bill of attainder or ex post facto law. That means Congress can't say, well, all you guys, well, pull something out of the headlines. You Somalis, you Somali people who are here, you're all crooks, etc. You're all terrible people. You all need to be thrown out of the country. That would be a bill of attainder because it identifies a group of people, a group, and basically not only accuses them of a crime, but also administers the punishment, which is deportation. That the Bill of Attainder is not constitutional because it violates due process and it erases the boundary between the three branches of government because it's not just legislative passing of a law, but it's executing that law, which is the job of the executive branch, and it's passing judgment, which is the job of the judiciary. So no Bill of Attainder, and you can't pass a law that somebody is then punished under for something they did before the law was passed. Uh, the Congress was not supposed to be able to tax people directly. That was superseded in 1913 by the 16th Amendment, which gives the Congress the right to raise taxes to you, well, the income tax. It can't charge import-export duties on goods being shipped between states, nor can it prefer one state over another. The next one's kind of interesting, how public money is spent. It says specifically, and this is, I think I put in it as a quote, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. So the federal government cannot spend any money that isn't authorized under a particular spending bill from Congress. There's an interesting case in the not too distant past where uh, individuals in the administration, this is during Ronald Reagan's first administration in the early 1980s, where a group of people had this plan. And you can see some of the individuals involved there. That's all Colonel Oliver North, Caspar Weinberger, who was what, Secretary of State, I think, at the time, and Elliott Abrams, and of course, Ronald Reagan. And what they did, let's see if I have this in the next figure. Yeah. What they did was they took U.S. arms and through an intermediary, actually the state of Israel, they sold those arms to Iran. And this is in 1981 and later. So it was after the revolution in Iran, the overthrow of the Shah, and basically the government that there is, the former government that's present in Iran now was in place then. It was selling arms to the Iranians. Hopefully, the intention was to try to make nice with the Iranian government sort of behind the scenes and try to normalize relations. They
Jim,
took the,
oh,
yeah, go
we have a
ahead.
comment in the chat. I don't know how much you'll be able to weigh in on this one, but it says, I heard that in theory, anything related to due process could theoretically be suspended if the Insurrection Act, under what circumstances could that act be passed? After all, the idea that an executive body can impose such a bill at any moment is a tad worrisome.
I haven't read up. This is on my list of things to do. I have not read up on the Insurrection Act. I'm more familiar with the much earlier laws, the Sedition and Alien Acts of 1798. So it is on my list of things to do. The question is, in looking at the Insurrection Act, we're presumably looking, there might be multiple versions of that, so we'd be looking at the most recent. What exactly does it say? How specific is it? Does it define what an insurrection is in sufficiently detailed ways that it's not constitutionally vague? The problem is, even with the Constitution, as you'll see as we go through this and subsequent talks, there's a lot of parts of the Constitution that are kind of vague. Uh, so it is worrisome, and we see very often a redefinition of words like invasion. A bunch of folks crossing the border might be worrisome and maybe it may endanger national security, but it doesn't constitute invasion in any sense that anybody's used to. An invasion is a state force armed coming in to essentially to conquer. That's an invasion. And yet it's used as justification for doing certain things under the law. So I promise I will look into that and have a few things to say about it next month. Anyway, regarding Iran-Contra, after they sold these arms to the Iranians, there was profit. And they took the profit and used it to support the Contra movement in Nicaragua. The Contras were a group who were trying to throw the left-leaning Sandinistas out of office. Congress had explicitly stated that no federal monies will go to Nicaragua. And so that group of men, the list I've got here, there's some like 14 people who are involved in this. including a Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, National Security Advisor and Assistant Secretary of State, CIA guys, really quite a mix of people, right down to Secretary Fawn Hall, who was the Secretary for Oliver North. They were all involved in this, and they were violating the Constitution. Um, Unfortunately, all of them were pardoned. Even those who were convicted or who had pleaded guilty were pardoned. I think it was it was by George H.W. Bush who pardoned them after the Reagan administration. And only one guy ever went to jail. It was this kind of arms dealer whose name is um, Thomas Clines. He was a former CIA person. I think one of the reasons he was convicted was because there was all this money coming in and, not declaring taxes, I guess. And he served for 16 months, but I think he too might have been pardoned. So his felony conviction would have been vacated.
And there is another comment in the chat that says,
Mhm.
I also heard Iran at the time mentioned was in the middle of a war with Saddam's Iraq. So maybe that's why we were supplying arms to Iran.
That's why Iran needed firearms, and they also needed the parts. Mostly they needed parts to repair the weapons they had, which were mostly American made because we'd been supplying the Shah of Iran with weapons. And it was not, we're not talking necessarily about carbines, the M16s or anything. We're talking about, missiles and that sort of thing. But yeah, they were fighting. It was a terrible war with Iraq, lots of death. Um, and we, for whatever reason, these guys anyway, were supporting Iran. But the point is, from our discussion, is that all this was a means of circumventing the Constitution. Every person on this list had taken an oath to support and uphold the United States Constitution, and they violated that oath. Um, Powers forbidden to states is sort of the last section of Article 1. Um, it's really doesn't really fit in with Article 1. I'm not quite sure why it's there. Maybe it should have been a separate article in and of itself because it doesn't seem to fit anywhere else in in the main part of the Constitution. No state shall enter into any treaty, grant letters of marque, that is basically, tell these guys they can be pirates as long as they prey on foreign shipping. They can't coin money. I mean, most of us know this sort of thing. States can't do these things. Printing of the coining of money is purely a federal thing. They can't tax imports and exports. That's a federal function. They can apply certain fees for managing the various ports, for inspecting cargo coming in, cargo going out, inspecting shipping, etc. But they can't actually really tax things. And third of that is uh, basically the states cannot raise a military force beyond the militia. They can't keep their own navy. Uh, it has whatever they do militarily has to be done with the consent of Congress. The states can raise militias, which are now on National Guard. They train, they organize, they select the officers for National Guard, but otherwise they sort of come under federal control when federalized by Congress and President. Anyway, boy, I really sailed through that faster than I thought. I know it's kind of text heavy, and it really is the nature of what we're talking about. Some of the stuff I talk about has a little more in the way of images. Uh, Next month, we're going to talk about the presidency, which again is a much smaller part of the Constitution, and it's a lot more vague. And it just sort of give you a little heads up on this. Congress had a pretty good idea of what a legislature should do. They didn't have a real good idea of what the presidency should be about. It was a novel type office they were creating. It had some background in terms of governorships, but governors until 1776 were generally appointed by the crown, and they answered to the crown. The idea of having a presidency, president who worked with a Congress, working out that relationship and figuring out what are the powers and restrictions on the presidency really befuddled them. And it befuddled them so much that they picked it up early in the uh, convention in early June, and they didn't get back to it until September, late mid-September, sort of late in the convention. It really puzzled them. And you'll see the month after we deal with the judiciary, that they said, well, there should be a Supreme Court and inferior courts as Congress dictates. And so basically they're saying we're not going to come up with anything in the Constitution for all this. We'll just do it through statute, through laws passed by Congress. But the presidency is covered by the Constitution, not so much by statute. But there's a lot of stuff in there that's kind of vague about the powers, the extent of powers of the presidency. And so let me stop sharing, and I will take on questions if you have any. Next week, the next talk should be even more relevant given what's going on today. I want to make it clear, though, I mean, I certainly have opinions, but we all do, unless we're asleep at the wheel. Um, but what we're covering in this series of talks has to do with how our government is structured, regardless of who is in office. It happens that right now, our Constitution is under a lot of strain. There's a lot of stuff going on that either is not addressed explicitly in the Constitution, and so it's kind of, uh, what can be done and what cannot be done. And some of it is just, I think, and I think a lot of people will agree, is outright violations of the Constitution. And that's not something we can really deal with in this. We can only talk about the Constitution, what it means, um, and make our own decisions, ask questions. This whole series I set up mostly because I have questions. I've dealt with these issues before, but this is an opportunity to really focus on the specifics of the Constitution. You'll see in the subsequent talks, it's a lot more critical. We start looking at different things, go, well, what does this mean?
So, so,
Go
okay.
ahead.
So I got a quick question. Maybe it's not quick. Something I heard on the news tonight made me think the states are supposed to be able to define voting qualifications. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Where
Exactly.
does it define that? I forget.
It The Constitution says that the states determine what the qualifications and the whole process of voting is in their respective states.
Right.
However, Congress can override those with statute law and with amendments to the Constitution. For instance, we have the 20-something amendment that gives 18-year-olds the right to vote.
Mhm.
So the Constitution, I think the Constitution says you have to be 21 years old, the original. That amendment allows 18-year-olds. So the Congress is telling the states you have to let people 18 and above vote. So that's an instance where Congress is establishing some rules, and they do the same thing with, the various civil rights type laws through statute.
Mhm.
Sometimes the 14th Amendment
Mhm.
says you have to let black people vote, adult male African Americans.
But was the right for 18-year-olds to vote, was that an amendment or was that a statute?
That's an amendment.
Okay.
14th Amendment, that amendment, and of course, was it the 19th Amendment, allowing women to vote. So those are instances where Congress tells the state some aspects of qualifications, but it doesn't tell the states how to
Process.
set up elections.
Yeah.
It also defines, and we'll talk about this subsequently, but uh, when's election day?
Yeah.
Originally, election day was November 1st through December 4th.
Because it took a long time to get to those voting places from the farms.
And Americans are just so, why can't we know exactly now who has voted president? I mean, why can't we have this information right now? It's almost midnight of election day. Forgetting that for many years,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
took weeks to find out who the winners were. And in the case of the election of 1800, it took even longer because we don't vote for the president. We vote for electors. And in 1800, two guys got the same number of electoral votes.
Well,
And
it put more pressure on that process because they moved the date of inauguration from March into January. So now they have a shorter time to be able to validate or certify the election.
well, that was really necessary because it was like 4 months
Yeah,
between the election and when a president took office and referred to as a lame duck session.
yeah, yeah.
And that was just too long. An outgoing Congress could do a lot of mischief in 4 months.
Mhm.
They do a lot of mischief in 2 months too, but not quite as much, especially since the winter holidays are in there.
Yeah.
And so they're often adjourned anyway. Uh, but yeah, states do determine, election, voting sites and all sorts of things. That's their prerogative, and including mail-in voting. If a state decides that mail-in voting is okay, that's fine. It is not. It is not prohibited under the Constitution.
Now, if
And
they
it's,
wanted to, if Congress wanted to change that, would that be
they'd
an
have to
amendment?
pass a law.
Could that be
Well,
a
they
law?
could they could do it through amendment, but let's face it, the chances of getting anything amended
Yeah,
nowadays is
that's
pretty
ridiculous.
remote. It was always hard, and now it's impossible. It would
Yeah.
be through statute. Congress would have to pass a law that specifically prohibits use of, well, they could probably do it by prohibit the use of the U.S. Postal Service for delivering ballots other than certain
Wow.
conditions, diplomats and military folks serving abroad, for instance. They can't very well show up in person. But yeah, it could be governed by statute. I don't know what the chances of that happening are either.
Mhm.
And in fact, everybody be shooting themselves in the foot because both parties get a lot of votes via the mails.
Especially from us old folks.
Yeah, yeah, and well, especially during the pandemic, which is,
Yeah.
when it really became popular, you mailed in your ballot instead of taking that risk. And with weather like today, if we had an early November storm, who wants to go out in this or heavy rains? You just mail it in. It's so much
Yeah.
easier. Any other questions or comments? Again, I think I talked about this last month. The Constitution is more than that little booklet that congressmen stick inside their jacket pockets
Mhm.
or the women carry, I don't know where. That's the literal Constitution. Those are the words. But to fully understand the Constitution, you have to read a whole lot more. There's a lot of critical material out there. There's some very good books. I think I shared them last time. If you want to see them again, I think maybe Allison can reshare them.
I can
Um,
do that.
but there's some good books out there. There's some really bad books out there too, though. Um, so if you have any questions, let me know. But some of the real page turners, I think. How some of these historians and lawyers and legal historians take apart the Constitution, analyze it, try to understand what it means.